After 36 years of searching for answers, investigators finally stood before the cameras with the truth about Christine Jessop's murder. But what they revealed that Thursday afternoon would shake an entire nation.
It was October 3rd, 1984, when 9-year-old Christine Jessop went missing from her home in Queensville, Ontario, just north of Toronto and York region. Hundreds of community members assisted in searching for Christine. Tragically, on December 31st, 1984, Christine was found in Sunderland, Ontario, in Durham region. She had been stabbed to death, and evidence that she had been sexually assaulted was located at the crime scene.
The man responsible for the brutal rape and murder of 9-year-old Christine Jessop wasn't a stranger lurking in the shadows. He wasn't some drifter passing through town. He was Calvin Hoover, a 28-year-old family friend who had helped search for Christine when she disappeared, who attended her funeral, who comforted her grieving mother for decades. But before, kindly subscribe to the channel to complete our first 1,000 subscribers. Thank you. So the man they've been hunting for over 3 decades had been hiding in plain sight all along. This is the story of the most devastating betrayal in Canadian criminal history. A story that will challenge everything you think you know about trust, community, and the monsters that walk among us. By the end of this investigation, you'll understand why this case didn't just destroy one family. It shattered an entire justice system. If you're ready to uncover the truth about how evil disguises itself as kindness, don't forget to hit that subscribe button now. Because what you're about to hear will change how you look at everyone around you. Leave a comment and let me know, how well do you really know your neighbors? Christine's story begins on October 3, 1984, in the small Ontario community of Queensville. But the betrayal that destroyed her family had been years in the making. Again, we kindly appeal to you to subscribe to the channel by hitting the subscribe button now, to be part of our loyal family. Thank you. October 3, 1984 started like any other Wednesday in Queensville, Ontario. Queensville wasn't the kind of place where parents worried about their children. Population barely 3,000. The kind of community where everyone knew everyone. Where kids rode their bikes until dark and doors stayed unlocked. Christine Jessop was exactly the kind of child who belonged in a place like Queensville. 9 years old. Brown hair, bright smile. The type of kid who saw good in everyone she met. Her mother Janet worked as a dental assistant. Her father Bob worked construction. Middle-class family. Nothing fancy, but they had what mattered most, they were close. Christine shared a bedroom with her older brother Ken. She loved school, loved her friends, and trusted the adults in her life completely. That trust should have protected her. Instead, it made her the perfect victim. Wednesday mornings meant Christine would catch the school bus alone. Her 13-year-old brother Ken had volleyball practice after school, so he wouldn't be riding home with her that day. Such a small decision. Ken staying for sports practice. If he'd come home with Christine that afternoon, she might still be alive today. But someone was counting on Christine being alone. Someone who knew the family's routine. Someone who knew exactly when Janet would be at work and when Christine would arrive home to an empty house. Someone who had been watching. Planning. Waiting for the perfect moment. The Jessop family had lived on Leslie Street for years. Quiet neighborhood. Everybody looked out for everybody else's kids. Christine knew all the neighbors by name. She especially knew Calvin Hoover. Calvin lived just down the street with his wife Heather. 28 years old, unemployed, but always willing to help out around the neighborhood. The Jessops considered him a friend of the family. Christine had even visited Calvin's house in the days before October 3rd. Just a normal visit between neighbors. Nothing unusual about it. Except Calvin Hoover was already planning Christine's murder. While Christine played at his house, while she laughed and talked with his wife, Calvin was studying her. Learning her routines. Understanding when she'd be most vulnerable. That Wednesday afternoon would be his chance. But here's what still haunts investigators today: Christine never saw it coming. Right up until the moment Calvin Hoover took her, she trusted him completely. Because that's what children do. They trust the adults who are supposed to protect them. Christine Jessop stepped off the school bus at the corner of Leslie Street and Davis Drive. Same routine as every other day. Walk the 2 blocks home. Let herself in through the unlocked front door. Janet Jessop was still at work. Bob was on a construction site. Ken was staying late for volleyball practice. For the first time in weeks, Christine would be completely alone. Calvin Hoover was waiting. 4:30 p.m. Janet Jessop pulled into her driveway after another routine day at the dental office. She expected to find Christine inside doing homework or watching television. The house was empty. Christine's school bag was gone. Her shoes were missing from beside the front door. But there were no signs of a struggle. No broken windows. No forced entry. It was as if Christine had simply vanished. But Janet knew her daughter. Christine never left the house without permission. Never went anywhere without telling someone where she was going. Something was terribly wrong. 4:45 p.m. Janet called the York Regional Police. The officer who took the call wasn't particularly concerned. 9-year-old girl missing for 15 minutes. Probably just playing at a friend's house. Kids do this all the time. Janet insisted this wasn't like Christine. Her daughter was responsible. She followed rules. She wouldn't just disappear. The officer said they'd send someone out to take a report. 5:30 p.m. Constable Gary Cook arrived at the Jessop home. He took down the basic details. Christine's description. What she was wearing when she left for school that morning. Cook suggested checking with neighbors. Maybe Christine was visiting someone and lost track of time. Janet had already called everyone she could think of. No one had seen Christine since she got off the school bus. 6 p.m. Bob Jessop came home from work to find his wife frantic and police at his front door. That's when the reality hit him. His little girl was gone. 6:30 p.m. Word spread through the tight-knit community of Queensville that Christine Jessop was missing. Neighbors began gathering at the Jessop home. One of the first to arrive was Calvin Hoover. Calvin told Janet and Bob how sorry he was to hear about Christine. He asked what he could do to help. He offered to organize search parties. Janet was grateful. In her worst moment, here was a friend stepping up to help bring her daughter home. She had no idea she was talking to Christine's killer. 7 p.m. As darkness fell over Queensville, dozens of volunteers began searching. They checked parks, playgrounds, wooded areas behind houses. Calvin Hoover didn't just join the search. He took charge of it. He divided volunteers into groups. He assigned search areas. He coordinated with police about where teams should focus their efforts. Calvin knew exactly where to send searchers. And more importantly, he knew exactly where not to send them. Because Calvin Hoover already knew where Christine was. She was dead. Had been for hours. But instead of confessing, instead of ending the family's agony, Calvin played the role of concerned neighbor. He comforted Janet when she broke down crying. He organized volunteer schedules. He became the public face of the community's effort to find Christine. It was a performance that would continue for 36 years. Midnight, October 3rd. After 8 hours of searching, volunteers called it a night. They'd covered miles of territory around Queensville. Knocked on hundreds of doors. Checked every basement, every garage, every possible hiding place they could think of. No trace of Christine Jessop. Janet and Bob didn't sleep that night. How could they? Their 9-year-old daughter was somewhere out there in the dark. Cold. Scared. Maybe hurt. But Christine wasn't scared anymore. Calvin Hoover had made sure of that. The search would continue for 89 days. Hundreds of volunteers would give up their time, their sleep, their peace of mind trying to bring Christine home. And leading them all would be the man who killed her. October 4th, 1984. Day 2. The search for Christine Jessop exploded beyond Queensville's borders. York Regional Police issued a province-wide alert. Christine's photo appeared on television news broadcasts across Ontario. The volunteer effort grew from dozens to hundreds. People drove from Toronto, from neighboring communities, from as far as Ottawa to help search for one missing little girl. Calvin Hoover emerged as the unofficial coordinator of the civilian search effort. While police focused on official channels, Calvin organized the community response. He set up a command post at the Jessop home. He created search schedules, assigned territories, coordinated with local media. When volunteers needed direction, they came to Calvin. When reporters needed quotes about the community effort, they interviewed Calvin. Calvin Hoover became the public face of the search for Christine Jessop. And he was perfect for the role. Calm under pressure. Articulate when speaking to media. Compassionate when comforting the family. He told reporters that finding Christine was personal for him. That he'd known her since she was small. That he wouldn't rest until she was home safe. Every word was a lie. But the community believed him. The media believed him. Even the police believed him. October 10th. 1 week missing. The search expanded to cover hundreds of square miles. Volunteers used boats to search rivers and ponds. Horseback riders covered farmland and forests. Private pilots flew grid patterns over York Region. Still no trace of Christine. Police began treating this as a potential abduction. The assumption of a runaway child was officially abandoned. This was now a criminal investigation. Detective Inspector Ron Pittman took charge of the case. Experienced investigator. 20-year veteran. He'd worked missing persons cases before, but nothing quite like this. The community response was unprecedented. Pittman had never seen volunteers so organized, so dedicated. He was particularly impressed with Calvin Hoover's leadership of the civilian effort. Calvin seemed to know exactly how to coordinate large groups of searchers. How to keep morale up during the darkest moments. Pittman began consulting with Calvin on search strategy. Where should they focus next? Which areas had been thoroughly covered? Calvin always had thoughtful answers. Because Calvin Hoover knew exactly where they shouldn't be looking. October 20th, Christine had been missing for 17 days. The massive search effort was starting to take its toll on volunteers. Long days in cold October weather. The emotional weight of not finding any trace of a missing child. Calvin Hoover kept everyone motivated. He organized shift schedules so searchers wouldn't burn out. He arranged for hot coffee and sandwiches to be delivered to search sites. He made sure every volunteer felt their contribution mattered. When morale flagged, Calvin gave impromptu speeches about not giving up hope. About how Christine was counting on all of them. About how they were Christine's best chance of coming home alive. The volunteers loved him for it. Here was a man who clearly cared as much as they did about finding this little girl. They had no idea Calvin was enjoying their pain. November 1st, Halloween came and went without Christine. Janet Jessop couldn't bear to buy candy for trick-or-treaters. How could she celebrate anything while her daughter was missing? Calvin stopped by the house that evening. He sat with Janet while Bob was out with another search party. He listened while she talked about Christine's favorite Halloween costumes from previous years. Calvin told Janet he understood her pain. That he couldn't imagine what she was going through. That he prayed every night for Christine's safe return. Janet was grateful for Calvin's friendship. In her darkest hour, he was one of the few people who seemed to understand her agony. She had no idea she was sharing her grief with her daughter's killer. Calvin Hoover had turned Janet Jessop's pain into his personal entertainment. November 15th, 6 weeks missing. The search was becoming more desperate. Volunteer numbers dropped as people returned to their normal lives. The media moved on to other stories. Even some family members began quietly preparing for the worst. But Calvin never wavered. He continued organizing search parties, continued coordinating with police, continued comforting the family. He attended every family meeting. Every strategy session with investigators. Every media briefing. Calvin Hoover had inserted himself so completely into the investigation that he'd become indispensable. When police needed to understand the timeline of Christine's disappearance, they asked Calvin. When reporters wanted to understand the community impact, they interviewed Calvin. Calvin had made himself the expert on Christine Jessop's disappearance. Because he was the only person who knew exactly what had happened to her. December 1st. 2 months missing. Winter was setting in across York region. Snow made searching more difficult. The realistic chances of finding Christine alive had dropped to nearly zero. But the official search continued. And Calvin Hoover continued leading the volunteer effort. He organized winter search protocols. He made sure volunteers had proper cold weather gear. He coordinated with police on areas that needed to be researched now that leaves had fallen from trees. Calvin's dedication impressed everyone involved in the case. Here was a man who refused to give up hope even when others were starting to accept the worst. But Calvin Hoover wasn't searching for Christine Jessop. He was managing the search to make sure no one ever found her. December 30th, 88 days missing. Tomorrow would mark 3 months since Christine vanished. The longest 3 months of Janet and Bob Jessop's lives. Calvin stopped by the house that evening. He told the family he wanted them to know that no matter what happened, the community would never stop looking for Christine. He promised them that someday, somehow, they would have answers. That promise would prove to be the cruelest lie of all. Because Calvin Hoover had no intention of ever letting the Jessop family find peace. Their suffering was exactly what he wanted. December 31st, 1984. New Year's Eve. While families across Ontario prepared to celebrate the dawn of 1985, a farmer in Sunderland, Durham region, made a discovery that would change everything. Christine Jessop's remains were found in a field, 55 kilometers from her home. She had been stabbed to death, and evidence of sexual assault was found at the scene. 3 months. For 3 months, hundreds of volunteers had searched. For 3 months, the Jessop family had held on to hope. Now, on the last day of the year, that hope was shattered. But here's what nobody knew that day: the man responsible for Christine's death wasn't just watching the investigation unfold. He was actively helping with the search. For 89 days, Christine Jessop had been missing. For 89 days, Calvin Hoover had led the search for her. Now she was found. But the nightmare was just beginning. Because when police arrested the man they believed killed Christine Jessop, it wasn't Calvin Hoover. It was her next-door neighbor, Guy Paul Morin. And that mistake would destroy an innocent man's life while the real killer continued walking free. The question that would haunt Canada for the next 36 years. How could an entire justice system get it so completely wrong? The answer would prove that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones offering to help you find your missing child. If you have watched this far, kindly subscribe to our channel to help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers. The crime scene told a brutal story. Christine had been tortured before her death. The evidence painted a picture of prolonged suffering that would haunt investigators for decades. But it also gave them something else, physical evidence that would one day reveal the truth. Just not the way anyone expected. The case was riddled with official errors, from inaccurate eyewitness testimony and police tunnel vision, to scientific bungling and the suppression of evidence. But in early 1985, investigators believed they had their man. Guy Paul Morin, 25 years old, lived next door to the Jessops. A clarinet player who still lived with his parents. Why did police zero in on Morin? Simple. He was different. He was awkward. He played classical music while his neighbors listened to rock. He kept bees. He made inappropriate comments about children. But being weird isn't the same as being a killer. Durham Regional Police focused its attention on Guy Paul Morin, a guy they figured to be odd, and that was enough to change the course of 2 lives forever. Here's what investigators didn't want to acknowledge: their timeline didn't add up. Morin had an alibi. Multiple witnesses placed him elsewhere when Christine disappeared. But when tunnel vision takes hold, inconvenient facts have a way of getting overlooked. And while police built their case against the wrong man, the real killer was still out there. Still free. Still helping with the search. Morin was charged in 1984 and acquitted in 1986 before a new trial was ordered. But that first arrest tore apart a small community that thought it knew its neighbors. The Queensville community split down the middle. Some rallied behind Morin, convinced of his innocence. Others whispered that they always knew something was off about the quiet musician next door. What would you do if your neighbor was arrested for murdering a child? Would you believe the police? Or would you trust your instincts? The Jessop family found themselves in an impossible position. They desperately wanted justice for Christine, but they also had doubts. Deep down, they wondered if police had the right man. Those doubts would prove to be prophetic. 1986, the Crown's case against Guy Paul Morin was built on circumstantial evidence and character assassination. They painted him as a dangerous loner whose odd behavior masked the killer's instincts. The key evidence? A jailhouse informant who claimed Morin had confessed. Inappropriate comments Morin had allegedly made about children. His strange demeanor in court. But here's what the prosecution couldn't explain: the timeline. Morin's alibi. The lack of physical evidence connecting him to the crime. Morin had been acquitted of the murder of 9-year-old Christine Jessop in 1986. Justice had prevailed, right? Wrong. The Crown appealed. Only to be found guilty at a retrial in 1992. Guy Paul Morin would face trial again, and this time, the stakes were even higher. While Morin fought for his freedom, the real killer watched from the shadows. The man who had actually taken Christine's life was living freely, probably sleeping soundly at night, knowing that someone else was paying for his crime. 1992, 6 years after his acquittal, Guy Paul Morin faced a second trial for Christine Jessop's murder. This time, the Crown had new evidence. DNA. Science was supposed to be the great equalizer. Objective. Unbiased. Definitive. But here's what nobody anticipated: scientific bungling would nearly destroy an innocent man's life. The DNA evidence seemed to implicate Morin. Hair samples. Fiber evidence. The prosecution argued that modern science had finally proven what they knew all along: Guy Paul Morin was Christine Jessop's killer. The defense fought back, questioning the chain of custody, the testing procedures, the handling of evidence. But the damage was done. A jury looked at the DNA evidence and saw guilt. Morin was found guilty of first-degree murder on July 30, 1992. Guy Paul Morin, an innocent man, was sentenced to life in prison for a crime he didn't commit. He appealed his conviction, and on February 9, 1993, was released on bail pending appeal. But the real breakthrough was still coming. And when it arrived, it would expose one of the most shocking miscarriages of justice in Canadian history. Days before Morin's appeal was to be heard, on January 23, 1995, DNA typing definitively excluded him as the perpetrator. How could this happen? How could the same technology that convicted Morin also exonerate him? The answer was disturbing. The original DNA evidence had been contaminated. Cross-contamination in the laboratory. Mishandled samples. Scientific bungling and the suppression of evidence. However, in 1995 Morin was exonerated due to advancement in DNA testing. He had served 18 months in prison. 18 months. For 18 months, an innocent man sat in prison while the real killer walked free. For 18 months, the Jessop family believed they had justice when they actually had nothing. January 23, 1995. Guy Paul Morin walked out of the courthouse a free man. The Crown formally withdrew all charges. He received $1.25 million and a public apology in compensation for his wrongful conviction. But money couldn't buy back the years of his life that were stolen. It couldn't erase the stigma. It couldn't restore his reputation in a community that had turned against him. Despite his exoneration, Morin lived with the suspicion that he murdered a young girl for 36 years. And for the Jessop family? For Christine Jessop's family there is no closure. They were back to square one. Their daughter's killer was still out there, and they were no closer to finding him than they had been in 1984. The Commission on Proceedings involving Guy Paul Morin, known as the Kaufman Commission or the Morin Inquiry, was a 1996 royal commission appointed by the Government of Ontario to address the wrongful conviction. The inquiry would reveal systematic failures at every level of the justice system. Police tunnel vision, prosecutorial misconduct, scientific incompetence. A perfect storm of errors that nearly destroyed an innocent man's life. But here's what the inquiry couldn't answer: who actually killed Christine Jessop? The real killer was still out there. Still free. Still carrying the secret of what happened to a 9-year-old girl on October 3, 1984. For 25 years after Morin's exoneration, the Christine Jessop case remained unsolved. Christine's mother, Janet Jessop, is still looking for her daughter's killer. "I want to find him, and that's my goal," Jessop said. Technology advanced. DNA databases expanded. New techniques emerged. But Christine's killer remained a ghost. The story of Christine Jessop is a tragedy that went on to engulf not one but two families and ultimately entangle authorities and the justice system itself in controversy. The Jessop family lived with unanswered questions. The Morin family lived with the aftermath of a wrongful conviction. And somewhere out there, a killer lived with the knowledge that he had gotten away with murder. But DNA has a long memory. And sometimes, justice comes to those who wait. The breakthrough that would finally solve Christine Jessop's murder was still decades away. But when it came, it would reveal a truth so shocking that it would redefine everything we thought we knew about this case. The real killer wasn't a stranger. He wasn't a random predator who struck and disappeared. He was someone the family knew. Someone they trusted. Someone who had been there all along, hiding in plain sight. And that revelation would raise the most disturbing question of all. How many other victims were there? 25 years. That's how long Christine Jessop's killer walked free after Guy Paul Morin's exoneration in 1995. 25 years of normal life. Going to work. Paying bills. Maybe celebrating birthdays and holidays. While the Jessop family lived in a different kind of hell. Every anniversary of Christine's death was a reminder that her killer was still out there. Every birthday she would have had was a wound that never healed. Every news story about another solved cold case was both hope and heartbreak. Hope that maybe their case would be next, heartbreak that it wasn't. Christine's mother Janet never stopped believing that someday, somehow, they would get answers. But as the years stretched on, that hope grew fainter. The investigation had gone completely cold. No new leads. No new witnesses. No new evidence. Just a degraded DNA sample that had been sitting in a file for decades, waiting for technology to catch up. But here's what the Jessop family didn't know: the man who killed Christine wasn't just living freely. He was living right under their noses. Calvin Hoover wasn't just any killer. He was a family friend. Someone Bob Jessop worked with. Someone who had access to their home. Think about that for a moment. While police were building a case against Guy Paul Morin, while the community was tearing itself apart with suspicion and doubt, the real killer was attending family barbecues. He was probably offering comfort to Christine's parents. He was living a double life that would make your skin crawl. Calvin Hoover didn't just kill Christine and disappear. He attended the searches for her when she first went missing. He was at her funeral. He looked Janet and Bob Jessop in the eye as they buried their daughter, knowing he was the reason she was dead. For 36 years, Calvin Hoover twisted the knife deeper with every interaction. Every holiday card he might have sent. Every time he asked any news about Christine's case. Every moment of fake sympathy was an additional act of cruelty toward a grieving family. This wasn't just murder. This was psychological torture on a scale that's hard to comprehend. But why do killers do this? Why insert themselves into the investigation of their own crimes? If you haven't subscribed, please don't forget to hit that button now. Forensic psychologists call it injecting themselves into the investigation. It's more common than you'd think. Killers often volunteer to help search. They attend vigils. They offer comfort to families. Sometimes it's guilt. Sometimes it's a need to control the narrative. But often, it's something much darker. They feed off the pain they've caused. Calvin Hoover wasn't just covering his tracks. He was savoring the devastation he had created. Every tear Janet Jessop shed in front of him was a victory. Every sleepless night Bob Jessop endured was satisfaction. The man who killed their daughter was watching them grieve for her. And he was enjoying it. For a psychopath, there's no greater high than successfully deceiving everyone around you while they suffer for something you did. Calvin Hoover had achieved the ultimate manipulation. He had turned the victim's family into his personal entertainment. But DNA has a long memory. And in 2019, science finally caught up to Calvin Hoover's decades-old secret. 2019 was the year genetic genealogy revolutionized criminal investigations. The same technology people used to find long-lost relatives was now being used to identify killers from decades-old crime scenes. Christine's case was reopened, and that degraded DNA sample that had been sitting in a cold case file for more than 30 years was sent to Othram Incorporated, a company that specializes in human identification from difficult DNA evidence. The technology had advanced far beyond what was available in 1995. Scientists could now extract usable genetic profiles from the smallest, most deteriorated samples. They could build family trees from fragments of DNA that would have been useless just a few years earlier. But here's what nobody expected. The breakthrough in Christine's case would come not from sophisticated police work, but from someone's curiosity about their ancestry. The process was painstaking. Investigators uploaded the DNA profile to genealogy databases and began constructing family trees. They were looking for genetic matches, people who shared enough DNA with the killer to be related to him. One by one, suspects were identified and eliminated. Family members were tracked down and interviewed. Alibis were checked. DNA samples were collected for comparison. The breakthrough came through a genealogy enthusiast who had uploaded his DNA profile to multiple ancestry websites. He had no idea he was about to help solve one of Canada's most notorious cold cases. The genealogist had unknowingly provided the missing piece of the puzzle. His DNA showed he was related to Christine's killer. From there, investigators could build a family tree and identify potential suspects. They were closing in on Calvin Hoover, and he had no idea. Calvin Hoover was 28 years old when he killed Christine Jessop in 1984. By 2020, when investigators finally identified him as the killer, he would have been 64. But there was one problem: Calvin Hoover had died in 2015. After 36 years of living with his secret, after decades of watching the Jessop family suffer, after successfully deceiving everyone who knew him, Calvin Hoover had taken that secret to the grave. He would never face trial. He would never have to look Janet and Bob Jessop in the eye and explain why he killed their daughter. He would never have to answer for 36 years of psychological torture. Calvin Hoover had cheated justice in the most cowardly way possible. October 15, 2020. Toronto police held a press conference that would finally give the Jessop family the answers they had waited 36 years to hear. Acting Police Chief James Raymer stood at the podium and spoke the words that changed everything: "We can now confirm that Calvin Hoover is responsible for the death of Christine Jessop." The revelation sent shockwaves through the community. Calvin Hoover wasn't some random stranger who had spotted Christine walking home from the bus stop. He was someone they knew. Someone they trusted. Someone who had been part of their lives for decades. The betrayal was complete and devastating. Christine's brother Ken reflected on the revelation. He was at the funeral. The man who had killed his sister had stood beside him as they lowered her coffin into the ground. Had probably offered condolences. Had maybe even hugged him. How do you process that level of deception? How do you come to terms with the fact that the person who held you while you cried was the same person who made you cry in the first place? Calvin Hoover's family was devastated by the revelation. His relatives had lived their entire lives believing they knew him. Suddenly, they were faced with the horrifying truth that the man they had loved, trusted, and shared holidays with was a child killer. His ex-wife was left with painful questions about the man she had been married to. Had there been signs she missed? Had she been living with a monster without knowing it? The community that had rallied around the Jessop family for decades was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. They had been rallying alongside Christine's killer. He had been at their fundraisers, their prayer vigils, their memorial services. Calvin Hoover hadn't just hidden among them. He had been one of them. So who was Calvin Hoover, really? Police revealed that he had outdated charges, but provided few details about his background or criminal history. What we do know paints a picture of a master manipulator. Someone capable of living a double life for decades. Someone who could look grieving parents in the eye and offer comfort while knowing he was the cause of their pain. This level of deception requires a specific type of personality. Psychologists call it psychopathy, the complete absence of empathy, combined with an ability to mimic normal human emotions. Calvin Hoover wasn't just a killer hiding in plain sight. He was a predator who weaponized human compassion. He used the Jessop family's trust against them. He exploited their grief for his own psychological satisfaction. And for 36 years, it worked perfectly. But Calvin Hoover's story might not end with Christine Jessop. Investigators have hinted at other cases, with one expert saying, "I think there'll be some more stories for us to share in the near future." How many other victims were there? How many other families did Calvin Hoover deceive while they searched for answers about their loved ones? The technology that solved Christine's case is now being applied to cold cases across the country. DNA samples that were useless 20 years ago are yielding new suspects today. Family trees are being built. Genealogy databases are revealing secrets that killers thought they had buried forever. Calvin Hoover may be dead, but the truth about what he did is very much alive. And that truth is spreading to other cases, other families, other long-buried secrets. For the Jessop family, knowing the truth brought a mixture of relief and renewed pain. Relief that they finally had answers. Pain that those answers revealed a betrayal deeper than they could have imagined. But most importantly, it brought validation. For 36 years, they had lived with the knowledge that their daughter's killer was still out there. Now they knew they had been right to keep searching. Right to keep demanding answers. Right to never give up hope. Christine Jessop's case became a landmark not just in Canadian criminal justice, but in the evolution of forensic science. It showed how genetic genealogy could solve the unsolvable. How technology could finally give voice to victims who had been silenced for decades. And it proved that no matter how clever a killer thinks he is, no matter how perfectly he believes he has covered his tracks, the truth has a way of catching up. Even if it takes 36 years. The Christine Jessop case is closed. But the questions it raises about trust, deception, and the masks that evil people wear will linger long after the headlines fade. Because somewhere out there, in communities just like Queensville, there are other Calvin Hoovers. Other killers hiding behind friendly smiles and offers of help. Other predators who have weaponized human compassion for their own twisted purposes. The technology exists to find them now. The only question is, how many more families are living with monsters they call friends? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't done that. October 15, 2020, the day Toronto police identified Calvin Hoover as Christine Jessop's killer should have been a day of complete triumph. After 36 years, the case was finally solved. The truth was finally revealed. But there was no courtroom. No trial. No moment where Calvin Hoover had to face the consequences of what he had done. Justice isn't just about knowing who committed a crime. It's about accountability. It's about a killer looking into the eyes of the people he destroyed and answering for his actions. Calvin Hoover robbed the Jessop family of that moment. He took the coward's way out, dying by suicide in 2015, 5 years before investigators could identify him as the killer. The Jessop family told reporters they were happily stunned and grateful to investigators who never gave up on the investigation. But that gratitude was mixed with frustration. After decades of waiting for answers, those answers came with the bitter realization that true justice would never be served. Sometimes the system works. Sometimes science catches up to evil. Sometimes families get the closure they've waited decades to receive. And sometimes it's just too late. For Guy Paul Morin, the identification of Calvin Hoover represented something even more profound than solving Christine's murder. It was complete vindication after 36 years of living under a cloud of suspicion. In a statement released by his lawyer, Morin said, "I am grateful that the Toronto police stayed on the case and have now finally solved it. When DNA exonerated me in January 1995, I was sure that one day DNA would reveal the real killer, and now it has." Even after his legal exoneration in 1995, Morin had lived with the knowledge that some people still believed he was guilty. Some people thought the DNA evidence was flawed, or that he had somehow escaped justice on a technicality. Now there could be no doubt. Science had not only proven his innocence, it had identified the real killer. Morin's sister, Denise Kowalski, said she was ecstatic that her mother lived to see her son exonerated beyond a doubt by science. For families touched by wrongful conviction, vindication isn't just about clearing a name. It's about restoring dignity to people who had it stolen from them. But vindication came at a cost. Guy Paul Morin lost some of the best years of his life to a crime he didn't commit. He lost his reputation, his sense of security, his trust in the justice system that was supposed to protect him. How do you calculate the value of a stolen life? How do you compensate someone for decades of suspicion and doubt? The revelation that Calvin Hoover was Christine's killer sent shockwaves through everyone who had known him. His former wife told CBC News that their family was devastated to learn he was the likely killer. Think about what that means for a moment. Calvin Hoover's ex-wife had been married to a child killer without knowing it. She had shared a bed with someone capable of the most horrific acts imaginable. In an exclusive interview, she said she had sleepless nights since learning the truth, asking herself how the man she was once so close with could have done such a thing. The people who loved Calvin Hoover were forced to confront an impossible question: how do you reconcile the person you thought you knew with the monster he actually was? His family became secondary victims of his crimes, forever associated with acts they had no part in committing. They would spend the rest of their lives wondering what signs they might have missed, what red flags they might have ignored. People in Queensville said they were stunned, devastated, and relieved. Some were in disbelief that it took 36 years to solve a case that many thought would never be solved. But the community also had to reckon with an uncomfortable truth. They had been living alongside a killer for decades. Calvin Hoover hadn't been a stranger lurking in the shadows. He had been one of them. How many times had neighbors chatted with him over the fence? How many times had he been invited to community events? How many times had people trusted him around their own children? The revelation forced an entire community to question their judgment, their intuition, their ability to recognize evil when it was standing right in front of them. The Christine Jessop case became a watershed moment in Canadian criminal justice. Morin's conviction has been cited as one of Canada's most famous wrongful conviction cases, leading to significant alterations in how police investigated murders. The Kaufman Commission's investigation into Morin's wrongful conviction exposed systematic failures at every level of the justice system. Police tunnel vision, prosecutorial misconduct, scientific incompetence, a rush to judgment that nearly destroyed an innocent man's life. But the case also taught us something else: how easily evil can hide in plain sight. Calvin Hoover wasn't some obvious monster. He wasn't the creepy loner that movies teach us to watch out for. He was a friend, a neighbor, someone who helped search for the very child he had killed. The most dangerous predators aren't the ones who look dangerous. They're the ones who look normal. The ones who offer to help. The ones who show up at funerals and memorial services with flowers and sympathy cards. It took 36 years, 3 police forces, and a massive search of DNA databases to finally, definitively, crack the case. But Christine's case represents more than just one solved murder. It represents the revolution in criminal justice that genetic genealogy has created. Cold cases that seemed unsolvable are now being cracked at an unprecedented rate. DNA samples that were useless 20 years ago are yielding new suspects today. Family trees built from genealogy websites are revealing secrets that killers thought they had buried forever. The technology that solved Christine's case is now being applied to hundreds of other cold cases across North America. Families who had given up hope are getting phone calls from detectives with news they never thought they'd hear. But technology can't bring back the dead. It can't undo the trauma. It can't restore the years that were stolen from both victims and the wrongfully accused. Even with Calvin Hoover identified as Christine's killer, questions remain. Police investigators stated their objective was to learn more about Calvin, to see where he was during those 3 decades, to determine if there were other victims or crimes he was involved in. How many other children did Calvin Hoover hurt? How many other families are still waiting for answers about their loved ones? The man who killed Christine Jessop lived freely for 31 years after her death. That's 3 decades of opportunity. 3 decades of access to potential victims. 3 decades of living a double life that nobody suspected. Serial killers don't usually stop at one victim. They escalate. They repeat their crimes. The statistical probability that Christine was Calvin Hoover's only victim is virtually 0. Somewhere out there, other families might be living with the same questions the Jessops carried for 36 years. Other parents might be wondering what happened to their children. Other cold cases might finally have their answers. Subscribe to the channel, and be a part of our loyal family. The Christine Jessop case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and society. How do we balance trust with caution? How do we remain open to helping others while protecting ourselves from those who would exploit that openness? Calvin Hoover weaponized human compassion. He used the Jessop family's grief as cover for his own guilt. He exploited their trust to avoid suspicion. But the alternative, living in a world where we suspect everyone, where we trust no one, where we see potential killers in every helpful neighbor, isn't really living at all. The lesson isn't that we should stop trusting people. The lesson is that evil often wears a friendly face, and we need to be aware of that possibility without letting it paralyze us. Guy Paul Morin's wrongful conviction stands as a stark reminder of what happens when investigators decide they have their suspect before they have their evidence. Police were so convinced that Morin was guilty, because he was different, because he was awkward, because he didn't fit their idea of normal, that they ignored evidence that didn't support their theory. While they built a case against an innocent man, the real killer walked free. Christine's family lived with the belief that her killer was behind bars, when he was actually still out there, possibly hurting other children. Tunnel vision doesn't just destroy the lives of the wrongfully accused. It allows real killers to continue killing. Numbers can't capture the true cost of what happened in the Christine Jessop case. Christine lost her life at age 9. She never got to graduate from elementary school, never got to go to high school dances, never got to fall in love or get married or have children of her own. Her family lost a daughter and sister. They spent 36 years living with unanswered questions, sleeping restlessly, jumping every time the phone rang, hoping it might be news about Christine's case. Guy Paul Morin lost years of his life to a wrongful conviction. Even after his exoneration, he lived under a cloud of suspicion that didn't fully lift until Calvin Hoover was identified as the real killer. Calvin Hoover's family lost their sense of reality. Everything they thought they knew about someone they loved was revealed to be a lie. The community lost its sense of security and trust. How do you put a price on any of that? Christine Jessop's story isn't unique. Across North America, families are living with unsolved murders. Innocent people are sitting in prison for crimes they didn't commit. Real killers are walking free while others pay for their crimes. The technology exists now to solve more of these cases. Genetic genealogy is revolutionizing criminal justice. But it takes time, resources, and investigators who refuse to give up. How many other Christine Jessops are waiting for justice? How many other Guy Paul Morins are waiting for vindication? How many other Calvin Hoovers are hiding in plain sight? The Christine Jessop case teaches us that evil doesn't always look evil. Sometimes it looks helpful. Sometimes it brings flowers to funerals. Sometimes it offers comfort to grieving families. Calvin Hoover attended Christine's funeral. He helped search for her when she first went missing. He probably offered condolences to her parents, looked them in the eye, and lied to their faces for 36 years. That level of deception requires a specific type of evil, not the chaotic, impulsive evil of a moment of rage, but the calculated, sustained evil of someone who feeds off human suffering. The scariest monsters aren't the ones hiding under the bed. They're the ones sitting at your dinner table, attending your children's birthday parties, helping you search for your missing loved ones. And they're everywhere. So here's what we're left with: how many Calvin Hoovers are in your community right now? How many helpful neighbors are hiding the darkest secrets? How many family friends are actually family enemies? How many people who offer comfort in times of crisis are actually the ones who caused the crisis in the first place? Would you know the difference? Would you be able to tell the difference between genuine compassion and calculated manipulation? The Christine Jessop case proves that sometimes you can't. Sometimes the person offering help is the person you need help from. Sometimes the person searching for answers is the person who knows all the answers already. But we can't let that knowledge paralyze us. We can't stop trusting everyone because some people aren't trustworthy. We can't stop helping our neighbors because some neighbors are dangerous. We just need to remember that evil often wears a friendly mask. And sometimes, the person trying to comfort you is the person who hurt you in the first place. Christine Jessop would have turned 46 in November 2020, just 1 month after her killer was finally identified. She would have been older than her parents were when she was killed. What kind of life would she have lived? What kind of person would she have become? What contributions would she have made to the world? We'll never know. Calvin Hoover stole all of that from her family, from all of us. But Christine's legacy lives on in the changes her case brought to the criminal justice system. In the safeguards put in place to prevent wrongful convictions. In the technology that's solving cold cases across the country. Her death wasn't meaningless. Her case made the system better. Her story is helping other families find the answers they've been seeking for decades. Christine Jessop, forever 9 years old, but never forgotten. The case that began with a little girl who didn't come home from school ended with proof that science can catch up to evil, that truth has a way of revealing itself, and that some families will never stop fighting for justice. Even when it takes 36 years. Even when the killer dies before facing consequences. Even when justice comes too late to truly matter. Because in the end, the truth always matters. And Christine Jessop finally has hers. Thank you for watching to the end. And if you are yet to subscribe, kindly hit the subscribe button now. Up next is another disturbing case that will make you chill. Stay safe.